Hello everyone, this is Mr. Lipchick, and our topic today is going to be world economic development. Okay, a few words about the different levels of economic development uh, that different countries in the world have. Development is defined as the process by which a nation improves the economic, political, and social well-being of its people. A developed nation is a nation with a higher average level of material well-being. All the nations in blue on that little map to the right are developed nations. Examples of developed nations: the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and Japan. There are also less developed countries, or LDCs, and this is defined as a nation with a low level of material well-being. While a nation's level of development is not an indication of its cultural superiority or inferiority, it is a measure of how healthy, productive, and educated and prosperous a nation is. Okay, measuring economic development. The primary measure of a country's economic development is the per capita GDP. Little error there, it should say per capita instead of per capital. Per capita gross domestic product, or per capita GDP, is a nation's gross domestic product divided by its total population. So, on average, what an average person within this nation produces in a given year. A country may have a very large GDP, but a very small per capita GDP. Per capita GDP is an indication of how much of a nation's population is employed outside of agriculture. Limitations of this measurement include the fact that it does not account for differences in the distribution of income between members of society. So it can be very unevenly distributed and not really represent the true state of affairs in that country. Also, the measurement of people employed outside of agriculture, basically, as societies become more developed, they have better farming implements and better farming strategies, and they can employ more people in industry. That's why agricultural employment is an important indicator. So if a wealthy elite controls most of the nation's GDP, the rich may primarily benefit from the work of most of the nation. So once again, per capita GDP can be misleading if it's not looked at very closely. Energy consumption is another measure of economic development in that it reflects a nation's level of industrialization. Industrialization is the extensive organization of an economy for the purpose of manufacture. High levels of energy consumption indicate high levels of industrialization, while low energy consumption indicates low levels of industrialization. Nations with low per capita energy consumption tend to have populations primarily engaged in subsistence agriculture. And what that means is they consume most of what they grow or make. Okay, so subsistence agriculture can be defined as the level of farming in which a person raises only enough food to feed his or her family. And to the right, you see a picture of some subsistence farmers in Bolivia who primarily survive through the herding of cattle. When most of a nation's workforce is devoted to subsistence agriculture, there are few people available to work in industry. An industrial revolution really cannot take place until people are freed up from agriculture. So there are few opportunities for workers to specialize in the making of consumer goods for sale in these nations. With no specialized goods for sale, these economies cannot generate cash for reinvestment. The number of consumer goods manufactured per capita is a measure of economic development. Now, we could debate about the quality of the lifestyle and so forth, or the value of having material things, but it is a measure of your level of economic development. It shows that people have the money to meet their basic needs with some left over for non-essential goods like the ones you see to the right. Examples of consumer goods: TVs, refrigerators, cars, phones, and washing machines. Okay. The literacy rate is another measure. The proportion of the population over age 15 that can read and write is a country's literacy rate. And you will see that literacy rate reflected on the map below. Most often, the more of a country's citizens that attend school, the higher its level of development. In situations where most of the people are involved in agriculture, frequently they cannot spare their children. They cannot let them go to school because they are needed on the farm. Okay, and literate populations are usually more productive in both manufacturing and agriculture, simply because they have the knowledge and skills to excel at those things. Life expectancy is another measure. Life expectancy is the average expected lifespan of an individual. People living in developed nations usually have much longer life expectancies than those in LDCs because of better diet, shelter, healthcare, and sanitation. This chart here is another measure, okay, which is the infant mortality rate, which is the number of deaths that occur in the first year of life per 1,000 live births. And this graph here shows where the United States ranks among the developed nations. So while we do have the biggest GDP in the world, we do not have the lowest infant mortality. Ours ranks with Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, whereas the Scandinavian countries are at the top. So it's a measure of economic development that illustrates a country's level of healthcare and nutrition, which tend to be very low in LDCs, or lesser developed countries. Okay, what are some characteristics of developed nations? Developed nations have a high per capita GDP, but most of their populations are neither extremely rich nor extremely poor. There's a higher degree of political and economic freedom in developed nations than in lesser developed countries. And consumer spending is higher in developed nations. Agricultural output is higher in developed nations because of technological advances in farming. Only a small portion of the labor force is needed to farm in a developed nation. Developed nations have been urbanized for many generations, with most of their populations living in cities. Along with urban growth, infrastructure has expanded in developed nations. Infrastructure is defined as the services and facilities necessary for an economy to function. Examples are roads, bridges, factories, schools, power plants, and other facilities. Okay, some characteristics of less developed nations. Less developed nations have low per capita GDPs. Unemployment is usually high, around 20%, whereas in a developed nation it's usually around 3 or 4%. There's not enough time or money available for most families to purchase consumer goods. Less developed nations have few resources for educating their populations. And the need for children to help in agriculture limits the time they can spend in school. So it's kind of a vicious cycle they're stuck in. It's difficult for them to relinquish the children to school because they need them for survival. Also, literacy rates in LDCs are very low, often below 50%. There are different levels of economic development, and these fall into stages. Number one, at the beginning, there is something called primitive equilibrium, where no formal economic organization or monetary system exists, and the economy is based on tradition. It's sometimes referred to as a traditional economy. There's the transition phase, in which cultural traditions begin to be replaced as people adopt new living patterns. There's takeoff, when new industries grow and profits are reinvested. And then there is a period known as semi-development, where the economy expands significantly and enters into the international market. And that's followed by the highly developed stage, where basic human needs are easily met. The economy is focused on consumer goods and public services. Newly industrial countries, or NICs, are defined as less developed countries that have shown significant improvement in the measures of development. An example are what are known as the four Asian tigers: Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, which have made substantial changes and growth. The World Bank is an international organization devoted to assisting development for many of these countries. It uses the gross national income, or GNI, to categorize nations as high income, middle income, or low income. That concludes our discussion for today, and I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you in our live lessons. Have a great day.